The Curse of the Forsaken Land. Part 1. Long before asphalt roads wound through the dense forests. Before towering concrete buildings cast their shadows over the land. This place belonged to the Native American tribes. They lived in harmony with nature, hunting in the thick woods and gathering from the fertile earth. Towering red rock formations stood like silent sentinels, witnessing centuries of their existence. Among these tribes was the Wahkan, a lesser-known but deeply spiritual people who had called this land home for generations. They thrived beside crystal-clear streams, under canopies filled with birdsong. But nature, though generous, was also cruel. One fateful year, a drought came. The rivers dried into cracked, lifeless trenches. The once lush grasslands withered into brittle husks. With no water, the animals fled, leaving the tribe to starve. The elders spoke in hushed voices, claiming it was a punishment from their ancestors, retribution for forgotten rituals and forsaken traditions. They prayed, they begged for mercy, but the sky remained empty. The earth parched and unyielding. In the end, the chieftain made a decision. They had no choice but to leave. Before their exodus, they performed one final, sacred rite. The dead were laid to rest in hallowed ground, a burial site meant to house their spirits for eternity. Towering stone markers were placed around the graves as a warning. This land was not to be disturbed. The tribal shamans carved ancient sigils into the stones, protective symbols meant to guard the spirits of the departed, and to curse any who dared defile their sacred ground. Then, the Wahkan vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind a silent, desolate land where only the wind whispered through the trees. Centuries passed. As America expanded westward, settlers arrived, clearing forests and building small towns. Soon, this land became just another forgotten piece of modern civilization, overgrown and lost to time. The sacred stones stood, their warnings unread and unheeded. Then came the 20th century, the era of industrial progress. With a booming population and rising medical needs, the local government saw the land as the perfect spot for a hospital. It was spacious, centrally located, and seemingly untouched. No one paid attention to the strange, weathered stones. No one questioned the eerie silence that hung over the land. No one remembered the Wahkan. Construction crews arrived, tearing into the earth with heavy machinery. From the very first day, the land resisted them. Accidents became a daily occurrence. Workers suffered mysterious injuries. Machines malfunctioned without cause, and strange whispers echoed through the night. Some claimed to hear crying in the wind, sorrowful wails that sent chills down their spines. Brick by brick, the hospital rose from the desecrated soil. And soon, Black Hollow Hospital was born, a name that seemed harmless enough. At first, it was just rumors. Patients spoke of figures standing in the corners of their rooms, watching, but when they turned, the figures would vanish. Nurses reported phantom footsteps echoing down empty hallways, as if something unseen was always lurking just out of sight. Some saw faces in mirrors, faces that didn't belong to anyone living. Doctors dismissed it as stress-induced hallucinations. But then, the horrors escalated. A patient died suddenly on the operating table, with no medical explanation. A young nurse lost her mind overnight, screaming that voices from beneath the floor were calling her name. A respected doctor disappeared without a trace. His office left untouched. His belongings still on his desk. Not a single clue was ever found. Fear took root in the town. Whispers spread about the curse on Black Hollow Hospital. They spoke of the stones that had been removed, the warnings ignored, the ancient wrath awakened, and beneath the hospital, buried deep within the soil, something stirred. The nightmare begins. Part 2. On a moonless night, as the wind howled through the empty corridors, the entire power system of Black Hollow Hospital suddenly went dead. Everything was swallowed in darkness, with only the trembling beams of flashlights held by the night shift staff. The emergency alarms blared piercingly, then abruptly fell silent. The entire electrical system had failed completely. No lights, no familiar hum of machines, only an all-consuming darkness engulfing everything. Dr. Robert Carter jerked his head up as the last fluorescent bulbs flickered and died. The hospital was now shrouded in an eerie silence. A cold draft swept down the hallway, though every window was sealed shut. "What the hell is going on?" whispered Nurse Emily, her hands trembling as she clutched her flashlight. "We need to check the electrical system and make sure no one is in danger," Dr. Carter ordered. He led a group of doctors and nurses into the darkness, their footsteps echoing against the cold floor like ghostly whispers from nowhere. As they passed room 13, Emily shuddered. The old wooden door creaked open slightly, though no one was inside. A freezing breath of air brushed against the back of her neck. She spun around, only to catch a shadow flickering at the far end of the corridor. "Is someone there?" Emily whispered, but no answer came. Dr. Carter stepped forward, shining his flashlight into the hallway corner. The dim light swept across the stained walls, then stopped. A figure stood motionless, dressed in an old hospital gown, hair hanging in matted strands over its face. "Who are you?" Carter called out. The figure didn't respond. It slowly turned its head, but instead of a face, there was only an empty black void where features should have been. A low, rasping laugh echoed through the corridor. Emily screamed. And in the blink of an eye, the shadow was gone. In the security room, Dr. Richard and two technicians frantically tried to access the surveillance footage. "This is weird. The system crashed, but the recordings are still here," one of the techs muttered. Richard rewound the footage, and what they saw made his blood run cold. At exactly 2:47 a.m., an empty corridor appeared on the screen. Then, out of nowhere, shadowy figures emerged, drifting forward in slow, unnatural movements. They had no faces, no distinct features, just shifting silhouettes barely visible in the flickering light. One of them suddenly stopped right in front of the camera. Its distorted face twisted, hollow eye sockets staring directly into the lens. The screen crackled with static. "What the hell is this?" Richard stumbled back, his hands shaking. Then, from the security system speaker, a whisper hissed through. "Give us back our land?" In room 206, patient Samuel Green, a middle-aged man hospitalized after an accident, was convulsing violently in his bed. His eyes bulged wide open, his entire body trembling. Nurse Maria rushed to hold him down. "Mr. Green, can you hear me?" Suddenly, his mouth opened, but what came out was not English. It was an eerie, ancient chant, spoken in a long-forgotten tongue. "Hakto na Wahkan, soda no." Emily felt chills crawl up her spine. "What is that? What's he saying?" Dr. Carter's face went pale. "That's an ancient native language. He's never spoken it before." Then, without warning, Samuel Green sat bolt upright. His eyes were void of emotion. His grip tightened around Emily's wrist. His voice dropping into a guttural rasp. "You have awakened them." Emily shrieked and wrenched herself free. Samuel collapsed back onto the bed, his body stiff as stone. From the depths of the hospital basement, a low, rhythmic sound began to rise. A drumbeat, ancient, ominous. Each pulse vibrated through the walls, shaking the entire building. Along the corridor walls, deep cracks began to form, and from those cracks, symbols emerged, glowing faintly, like markings long buried beneath the paint, now reclaiming their place in the world. The alarms wailed, but no one could control the chaos anymore. A frigid wind howled through the hospital, carrying whispers from the long dead. Tonight, Black Hollow Hospital no longer belonged to the living. The Knocking in the Night, Part 3. Jonathan Miles, director of Black Hollow Hospital, sat alone in his office on the top floor. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. A shrill, wailing sound that scraped against the silence like fingernails on glass. Miles was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of the nonsense whispered in hospital hallways. But tonight, something felt wrong. The power outage had plunged the entire hospital into darkness. The tech team was still struggling to restore the system. The alarms had finally stopped blaring, but the tension in the air remained suffocating, oppressive. He rose from his chair and poured himself a glass of whiskey from the cabinet. As the amber liquid filled the glass, he lifted it to his lips. Slow, heavy, deliberate, Miles froze, frowning toward the door. It was past 2 a.m. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? Setting his glass down, he strode to the door and pulled it open. Nothing. The hallway was pitch black, save for the dim, flickering glow of a flashlight in the distance. His frown deepened as he shut the door and returned to his desk. But the moment he sat down, louder, more urgent, irritated now, Miles yanked the door open. Empty. But the air was different. Colder. So cold that his breath curled in the air, misting in front of him. A chill ran down his spine. Then, from behind him, just a whisper, hoarse and rasping, carried on an icy breath. "Give it back, our land." Miles spun around. No one there. But something was. He could feel it. Suddenly, the lights in his office began to flicker erratically. In the corner of the room, shadows coalesced, forming the shape of a man. A Native American figure, emaciated and hollow-eyed, his face twisted in silent agony. He wasn't walking, he was floating, his bare feet hovering inches above the floor as he drifted toward Miles. Heart hammering, Miles stumbled backward. "Get out!" he bellowed. But the apparition did not stop. Then, it opened its mouth. No words, just a grotesque sound, like bones snapping, like wet, gasping breaths, like someone choking on their last moments of life. The overhead lights exploded, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Miles fumbled for the flashlight on his desk, his hands trembling as he switched it on. The beam cut through the shadows, and he recoiled in horror. A hand, withered, skeletal, claw-like, emerged from the darkness, scraping across the surface of his desk, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the wood. A face loomed into the light, twisted, carved with deep slashes. Its eyes were nothing but pools of black void. Miles screamed, stumbling backward, his spine hitting the wall. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out every rational thought. Then, the room shifted. The walls cracked open, dark veins spreading through them. From the gaping fissures, blood began to seep, running in rivulets down the walls, pooling on the floor. Distant, anguished cries echoed from the depths beyond the cracks. And then, a hand lunged from the darkness and wrapped around his throat. Miles gagged, struggling, clawing at the unseen grip. But it was impossibly strong. Ice-cold fingers squeezed, crushing his airway. His vision blurred, his lungs burned. Desperate, he thrashed, flailing wildly. And then, everything stopped. Miles collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Sweat drenched his body. His heart thundered violently in his chest. Silence. No ghost. No blood. No shattered lights. He sat there, panting, hands trembling. Just a nightmare. Just stress. Just his imagination. But as he looked down at his hands, his breath caught in his throat. Deep, dark bruises marred his neck. Not a dream. Not his imagination. Something had been here, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The Awakening Curse, Part 4. Darkness consumed Black Hollow Hospital, bringing with it an unbearable chill that seeped into every shadowed corner. The few souls still awake inside felt their breaths grow shallow, as if an unseen force was squeezing the very air from their lungs. None of them knew that this night would be the most horrifying of all. Dr. Ethan Grayson, the hospital director, sat in his dimly lit office, eyes locked on the security monitor. The screens flickered, displaying empty hallways, eerily silent, ever since the mysterious disappearance of Dr. Matthews. Ethan had taken it upon himself to personally oversee all surveillance. But tonight, something was wrong. On one of the monitors, a figure stood motionless in the hallway, its back turned to the camera. The person wore a patient's gown, but their face was obscured by long, matted black hair. Ethan's stomach twisted. No patient should be wandering around at this hour. He reached for his radio. Security. Get to hallway C immediately. There's someone. Before he could finish, the figure moved. It snapped its head toward the camera. A pale, hollow face. No eyes. No nose. Just a gaping, black abyss of a mouth. The screen glitched, then went completely dark. The room was swallowed by shadows. Ethan shot up from his chair, heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled with the power controls. Nothing. A cold breeze slithered across the back of his neck, sending ice down his spine. The office door let out a slow, creaking sound, as if something was waiting just outside. Then, Ethan swallowed hard. Impossible. No one should be here. The knocking came again, louder, more urgent. He yanked open his desk drawer, pulling out the handgun he always kept there. His fingers trembled as he pointed it toward the door. The door burst open. No one, but just as the emergency lights flickered for a brief second, Ethan saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room, staring right at him. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the air. Before Ethan could react, the entire office shook violently. Papers flew, the windows cracked. Then, total darkness. When the lights sputtered back to life, the shadow was gone, but a voice, deep, ancient, and inhuman, whispered into his ear, as if rising from the depths of the earth. "You do not belong here." Dr. Emily Carter, one of the hospital's finest physicians, was making her rounds in the ICU. But as she stepped into the corridor, something felt wrong. The hallway stretched longer than usual. The overhead lights dimmed, flickering erratically, as if warning her. Then, the murmuring began. At first, it was just a faint whisper, like the wind sneaking through a crack in the wall. But then, it grew. Louder, sharper, dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in a language she didn't understand. She turned. A group of figures stood in the middle of the hallway. They wore tattered clothing, their skin ghostly pale, eyes hollow. Faint tribal markings glowed on their flesh, pulsating like embers in the dark. Emily backed against the wall, her breath quickening. One of them, a woman, stepped forward. Her eyes were bottomless pits, her lips parting as if to speak. But instead of words, thick black smoke poured from her mouth, swirling like a living thing. Emily screamed. Then, the lights flared. Everything vanished. Silence. Emily stood there, shaking, chest heaving. It had to be a hallucination. Stress. Exhaustion. But what she didn't know was that in the mirror beside her, the spirit still remained, watching. On the highest floor, the horror continued. A psychiatric patient, one who had been mute since birth, suddenly spoke. Not in English, in an ancient Wahkan dialect. His voice was deep, otherworldly, carrying an authority that did not belong to him. The strange incantations he muttered sent a tremor through the walls, making the overhead lights flicker violently and the hospital bed rattle. Nurses rushed in, trying to restrain him. The moment they touched him, his skin ignited, not with fire, but with darkness. Glowing tribal symbols burned across his body, illuminating the room in an eerie red hue. Then, he laughed, a laugh that did not belong to any living being. The nurses were flung across the room, crashing into the walls. When they lifted their heads, the patient was gone. All that remained was a message, carved deep into the ceiling. "You have awakened us. The reckoning begins now." Black Hollow Hospital was no longer just a hospital. It had become a living nightmare. A place where vengeful spirits roamed freely. A place where ancient horrors had stirred from their centuries-long slumber. And tonight, no one would leave unscathed. The door had been opened. The awakening of the spirits. Fan Kuor. Darkness swallowed Black Hollow Hospital. No longer just flickering shadows or strange whispers. Now, the hospital had become a realm of the dead, where vengeful spirits rose to reclaim what was theirs. There was no way out. No one could escape. Dr. Ethan Grayson slumped over his desk, sweat soaking through his shirt. His breath came in sharp gasps as the voice from beneath the earth echoed in his ears. "You shouldn't be here." His computer screen remained black, but in the split second he blinked. A pale, lifeless face appeared. Hollow, pitch-black eyes stared straight into his soul. Then, in a voice that sent ice through his veins, it whispered, "Tonight, blood will be spilled." Suddenly, the office window shattered. A freezing gust of wind rushed in, carrying hundreds of invisible hands clawing toward him. Ethan bolted from his office, sprinting down the hallway, but the further he ran, the more distorted the hospital became. The corridor stretched endlessly. Walls trembled. Nameplates of doctors crashed to the ground, spinning eerily in the air as if controlled by an unseen force. Blood seeped from each nameplate, forming a chilling message. All will die. No escape. Downstairs, Dr. Emily Carter led a group of nurses and security guards, desperately searching for an exit. But the main doors were gone. Before them stood a long, pitch-black hallway, leading to a rusted iron door, one that had never existed before. Beyond the door, a murmur echoed. Voices whispered in the air, speaking in the ancient tongue of the Wahkan tribe. A young nurse clutched Emily's arm, trembling. "Doctor, we can't go in there." But they had no other choice. The door creaked open on its own. Icy air rushed out, carrying the stench of blood. Inside was not a room. It was another world. A vast, ancient graveyard stretched before them. Dug up graves, scattered remains. In the center, a ritual circle drawn in blood. Candles burning, flickering against the night. And standing within the circle was a towering figure, his face concealed by a bone mask. His body covered in sacred tribal tattoos. The last shaman of the Wahkan people. Slowly, he lifted his head, his deep voice reverberating through the air. "You have defiled sacred ground. Tonight, the curse will be fulfilled." He raised his hands, and the earth trembled violently. Decayed hands burst through the soil, bones cracking as they clawed their way out. The spirits buried for centuries had awakened. Emily screamed, "Run!" but it was too late. The ghosts swarmed, phasing through bodies, filling the air with agonized screams. A security guard collapsed, his eyes rolling back, his body torn apart by an invisible force. Ethan rushed in, raising his gun, firing at the shaman, but the bullets passed through as if he weren't there. Then, a violent wind howled through the room. The ritual circle ignited in flames. And from the inferno, a massive entity emerged, the vengeful spirit of Wahkan. It was no longer human. It was pure wrath incarnate. Its eyes burned with fire. Its form wreathed in smoke and ash. It let out a guttural roar that shook the entire hospital. Walls cracked. The floor collapsed, revealing a bottomless void. And in that final moment, Emily understood. There was no survival. No one would leave this place. The end of Black Hollow. The hospital exploded in a blinding flash of light. The screams of those inside were silenced, replaced by absolute nothingness. When the light faded, Black Hollow Hospital was gone. All that remained was a wasteland of ash and debris. No survivors. No trace of the hospital. As if it had never existed. From a distance, the townspeople watched in silent horror, staring at the desolate land where the hospital once stood. No one dared to step closer. because they knew the curse was not over. This land would never belong to the living. It had, and always would, belong to the spirits of the Wahkan tribe.